The first one is that I'm not of Palestinian background. Some people have contacted me and because of my last name thought I was Palestinian. I'm not. My father was Egyptian and my mother is Danish. So that's why the weird last name comes from. And I'm saying this just to underline that when I'm speaking on this subject, I'm speaking from an outsider's perspective. So even though Gaza was part of Egypt actually from 48 until 67, you know, I don't have any connection to Palestinian land. So I'm speaking from an academic perspective and from an outsider's perspective. The second disclaimer that I have to make is about my affiliation with UCL University College. Unfortunately, I would say I'm not here on behalf of UCL, so I'm not, you know, expressing their official position. I'm only expressing my own views. And the reason I have to say this is because I have quite a disagreement right now with the top management about how to deal in academia with this subject. So just to make that clear, I'm expressing my own views. All right, let's go. Scholars Against the War is a coalition that I joined a few months ago. It's a transnational coalition of academics speaking up against the injustice in Palestine. And I'm drawing on their toolkit for international action on Scholasticide in the following points. And I would suggest anyone with interest in this topic go visit their website and see if it might be an interesting coalition for you also. So the term Scholasticide, for those of you who've never heard about this, maybe you have some idea of it, but I would say the first entry of this term comes from Kamran Abulsi, the British Palestinian Oxford professor. Sometimes this term is referred to also as ecocide, but Kamran Abulsi was the first one to coin the term during one of the first wars against Gaza in 2008 and 9. And I'll quote, "The role and power of education in an occupied society is enormous. Education posits possibilities, opens horizons. Freedom of thought contrasts sharply with the apartheid wall, the shackling checkpoints and the choking prisons. The systematic destruction of Palestinian education by Israel has countered that tradition since the occupation of 1967. Now in Gaza, we see the policy more clearly than ever, this Scholasticide." So what she's pointing to here is how the role of education and education as kind of, you know, a basic foundation for any society is seen as a threat by the Israelis because it's seen as a source of resistance. So we have to remember, of course, that Israeli is an occupier. So when the occupied people are educating themselves, gaining access to knowledge, this is seen as a potential source of resistance and a potential source of power. So, and Abulsi is one of the first to see this quite clearly and then introducing the term. But when we look at the Scholasticide term, we will see that it's a lot more nuanced than just the killings of professors. There are so many categories and sometimes more subtle ways that you can oppress education in a society. And now I will briefly just give an overview of some of the most well-known aspects of Scholasticide. And afterwards I will try to give some more concrete examples from the current war, but also from the history of oppression against Palestinians. So the first two ones, number 1 and 2, the killings of academics and students and causing bodily or mental harm to students or academics. I guess most of you in here already knows about this, and I'm happy that Student Against the Occupation also mentioned Rifat Al-Arir, as he's one of the most famous academics of Gaza, and he was exactly killed and assassinated after receiving threats in the weeks up to his killing. And the point here is these are not just collateral damage killings. They're not accidental. It's part of a more systematic, well-thought strategy of the Israeli occupation forces. Number 5 has also had very great and devastating long-term impact on Palestinians' educational system in this war, the bombardment of schools and educational institutions. And then I want to point to number 6 and also number 7 and number 11. The whole bureaucracy in an occupied society like Palestine is quite it's a quite difficult environment to even create universities. We have to remember the first university in Palestine, the Bir Said University in the West Bank in Ramallah, you know, it only goes back to 1975. The first university in Gaza, the Islamic University, was established in 1978. So it's a relatively new sector that it's been very difficult for the Palestinians to even create this sector because they had to create an educational system under occupation. So they are not, you know, they are not doing this in a surrounding of normal civilian law. They are creating academic institutions within a military bureaucracy, within the occupation military orders of Israel. So for example, order number 854 says that any student, any teacher, any administrator attending a university, both as a student and as a staff, has to be officially approved by the Israeli military. So they have to receive, you know, an official approval of enrollment before attending the university. So this is just, you know, to point to other examples of scholasticide that might not seem as dramatic as killing, but nonetheless have quite devastating effect on Palestinian society. Number 14, I am personally very concerned about this aspect of scholasticide when we talk about the rebuilding of Gaza in the years to come. So the impeding the import of essential materials for rebuilding. We've all seen the pictures and videos from the last few days of extremist settlers stopping aid for coming in and, you know, destroying humanitarian aid. So I think we have to be very aware in the academic society around the world to oversee this import of materials for rebuilding Gaza and the educational system when the war has ended. Because we cannot expect the Israelis to let this happen. We will probably see this number 14 put in action, you know, the impeding of rebuilding materials. And of course, all of these categories, there are plenty of examples, well-documented examples, often actually by Israeli scholars, which is quite an interesting phenomenon, that some of these styles and variations on scholasticide are very well documented by the Israeli scholars inside Israel. And even sometimes by the military themselves, because they would, you know, the IDF soldiers will often post videos of these acts on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, and so forth. So the first example I'll point to is from the current war. And of course, these numbers, you know, are changing all the time. And probably we will see that at the end of the war, this number will be a lot higher. But the current official numbers that are referred to by the UN Human Rights Council says that at least 15% of the total population of Palestinian students have been killed or injured. So it's more than 13,000, and probably the real number, if you take into account all the people who are still under the rubble, is probably closer to 20,000. I've seen some estimates. And the reason why I'm pointing to this is that the UN on the 18th of April put out an official press release using the word scholasticide. The UN Human Rights Council has started using the word scholasticide, and they say about these attacks that they are not isolated incidents. They present a systematic pattern of violence aimed at dismantling the very foundation of Palestinian society. So these are not my words, these are the words of the UN Human Rights Council, right? Here you see a very clear connection to the Genocide Convention. Because if we look at Article 2 and especially Section A and Section B, we are exactly seeing this systematic killing. And the numbers speak for themselves. So 5,400 students have been killed, 95 professors, and so forth. And of course the whole sector of journalists, healthcare professionals are rising every day. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. I mean, the mental harm on Palestinians, the mental harm on students, you know, we haven't even talked about that, right? But in the years to come, of course, there will be huge psychological trauma. And in my line of work in the NGOs, I've seen how post-traumatic distress syndrome has a direct effect on the cognitive skills on human beings. So this, we will see long-term impact on the mental health of the current students, but also the children who someday hopefully will become students. So we cannot underestimate this part. And just like was said in the beginning, introducing this day, we have to remember that behind these numbers there are real people, right? They're real names. Refat Al-Arir is also up here. Islamic University of Gaza, right here in the middle. We have to, in my opinion, those of us speaking about this, we have to be very careful that we don't become part of the dehumanization by only speaking in numbers, right? We have to always remember behind those numbers there were real careers, real colleagues, real people. And the same goes forth for all the healthcare professionals. You know, it's been quite heartbreaking researching this topic because sometimes, sometimes I would end up at a LinkedIn profile of some of these people, and you know, see their career, their backgrounds, see all the steps in a professional career, just like myself. I'm on a professional path, right? I was born, I attended school, I went to university, I started teaching, and I have a LinkedIn profile. The same goes for all these people, and we must never forget that. These are real people. Okay, the next example is in other ways more, you know, it's more about the future than the current moment. It's the bombardment of all of these institutions. This was how I personally came upon the concept of scholasticide. And to be honest, I didn't believe it at first. I didn't believe it. I saw an Instagram post claiming that all universities have been bombed, and I thought it can't be true. And I started researching each of these institutions and found out that there were documentation for all of the attacks. But I want to point specifically to the demolition of Al-Isra University in January, because this was a controlled demolition. So it's not, you know, one of those cases where you have the warplanes bombarding and then a bomb hits the university. You know, this is a case of putting explosives in a systematic manner all around the building and then blowing it up. So I'll just show the video. And here we have the case of the IDF televising their own scholasticide. Right? This is an IDF soldier who made this video. At this point, the university had already been besieged for 70 days. So first they invaded, then they turned it into a military compound and interrogation center, and then after 70 days, they completely leveled the university. And this is just one example. So there are several of these examples, but this is probably the most dramatic one. I don't know how many knows of the Dahiya doctrine, but it's a military doctrine of the IDF that might give us an idea of why the Israeli military is conducting this kind of devastating attacks. So this military doctrine refers to the Dahiya neighborhood of Beirut, a neighborhood that was completely destroyed during the war against Hezbollah in 2006. And what this military doctrine says, and we have military commanders of the IDF openly speaking about this doctrine. If you Google it, you can find several sources on this. But it's a tactic of asymmetric warfare and disproportionate force as a sort of collective punishment. So what one of the IDF commanders said, and he's actually, his name is Gadi Eisenkot, he's a member of the war cabinet right now. Back in 2006, he said, if a missile is fired from a Palestinian village, one missile, then we will attack with disproportionate force and level the whole village. And we will not consider the village a civilian zone. So this doctrine is exactly about not making a distinction between military targets and civilian infrastructure. So it's just to present some background on how can it even happen, this style of scholasticide. And of course, all of this is war crimes. I mean, if you look at the Geneva Convention, it says that you have to always make distinctions between military targets, civilian targets. If you look at the Rome Statute, in the criminal court. It also defines attacks on schools, hospitals, and civilian infrastructure as a war crime. Nonetheless, we see this carried out all the time in the Palestinian territories. So the UN, again, they are pointing to this as an example of long-term effect. And this, my point here is that we are also seeing the destruction of the future generations of students, the future generations of professors and teachers. And in many ways, this style of scholasticide is more connected to Section C in the Genocide Convention, Article 2, because it is inflicting on the group conditions of life. So it's not necessarily the killings in the present moment or the causing of harm, bodily harm. It's a more long-term form of scholasticide, where you inflict on the group conditions of life in the Palestinian territories by removing the options to educate yourself, by eliminating the sources of knowledge and professional expertise. And of course, it's also an obvious violation of human rights Declaration, Article 26. Everyone has a right to education. So this is what the UN Human Rights Council is pointing to when they say that this callous attack on educational infrastructure in Gaza has a devastating long-term impact on the fundamental rights. So the fundamental rights here, among others, is Article 26 specifically. So if we turn back to Al-Isra, when I say it is inflicting on group conditions of life, what I mean is that in all of these departments, right? Again, this was a real university, just like this one, with real students, real lecture halls, real departments. All of these departments were educating people whose role was to create conditions of life for Palestinians, nurses, psychologists, business professionals, lawyers, and so forth. So here we see scholasticide as an attack on the future of a Palestinian state more than on the present moment, or not only on the present moment. And again, we have to remember that we have to not be blinded by the dramatics of explosions and so forth. We have to remember before it was demolished, it was used as a sniper location for the military. So there are several documented reports of snipers, Israeli snipers, in the buildings of Al-Isra targeting civilians in the surrounding areas. And of course we have to ask ourselves, when our own prime minister here in Denmark, she's talking about the threat from Russia, right? All the time. She's talking about, we have to prepare ourselves for a time where there's no peace in the near future. We have to prepare ourselves for war and buy weapons and so forth. But we have to ask ourselves, what would we expect of the international community if something like this happened here in this campus? I know it's hypothetical, but we have to ask ourselves, if Russia invaded Copenhagen and they put snipers on the roof and they turned this auditorium into an interrogation center and they started targeting civilians walking in Østerfejmarksgade, what would we expect of the international community of academia? Well, we definitely wouldn't expect silence, right? We would expect full condemnation, full acts of solidarity, and we would expect the responsible military commanders, Russian leaders to be taken to international courts of justice. So we have to be, have a more long-term view on this aspect of war, because we never know when we are the ones getting besieged. Again, we have to remember the real people in this zone. This video is from last week, Monday. It was one of the first days of the bombardment of Eastern Rafah. And this one really hit me because, this father, he's escaping the bombing in Eastern Rafah. And they are literally running away from the bombs, and then he starts talking about education, right? Like everyone with an Arab father, know the role of education in Arab culture. So even when they're getting bombarded, he starts talking about, my daughters need to get a good education. I mean, I don't want to make fun of this, it's just to point to how deeply rooted the thirst for knowledge and the idea of education as one of the most foundational parts of life, of family life also. And I've experienced this also in my work with refugees from around the world. Even when they've lost anything or everything in their life, and they have to go back to maybe getting deported, they are still thinking about, oh, how can my kids attend school? What are the options for education? And Nabulsi also points to this, Karma Nabulsi again, when she says that education is the most important thing. It's the part of the family life, part of your identity, and of course also a source of resistance in an occupied society. Okay, next example, which is quite different, because the first two examples has mostly to do with the present and the future of Palestinian identity. This example is more about the past, or the attempt to eradicate the notion of a Palestinian past. Because this was the looting and the destruction of the Palestine Research Center during the invasion of Lebanon in the 80s. We saw how the IDF started, before bombing the place, they started confiscating all kinds of archival material. Photographs, microfilms, old manuscripts, all kinds of research material and archival material, and they treated it as what is called booty of war, as enemy property, and then they blew up the place. So even when the intellectual elite of the Palestinians were exiled, they were targeted by Scholasticide, is my claim. Then what's quite interesting again is that how important knowledge is to the Palestinians, because the PLO actually treated the confiscated material as a prisoner of war. So they were having negotiations with the Israelis, and they insisted that this material be treated as if it was a person. So it was part of the condition for prisoner exchange in late 83 in December. And the reason why I'm bringing up this example is because one of the best, most clear-viewed analysis of this style of scholasticide is by Mahmoud Darwish. Some of you may know him. He's a very famous Palestinian poet. So this is in 84. We have to remember this is less than 20 years into the Israeli occupation. Darwish is already seeing this style of scholasticide as something that has to do with the eradication of past, with the erasure of collective memory. So he says that, and I quote, "The development of Palestinian cultural activity compelled Israel to eradicate anything that has to do with a past relation, a present relation, or a future testimony." And he goes on a bit later and he says, "He who steals land does not surprise us by stealing a library." And I think this is a very, it's a very strong view on how the attack on Palestinians also sometimes is an attempt to eradicate the notion of Palestinian identity and the idea of Palestinian history, the narrative of Palestinian belonging to this land. Well, if you want to destroy that, it's not enough to kill the librarian, right? You have to burn all the books, or at least confiscate the books and try to change the narratives like the Israelis did. And now we see history repeating itself. In November, the Central Archives of Gaza was completely destroyed. This was one of the richest sources depicting the life and culture in the Gaza area for the past 150 years. So, all kinds of from interviews with people of the Nakba 48 to photographs and diaries and all kinds of archival material was destroyed. And the same happened to the main library of Gaza also in the past months. Which brings me to my last example, which is this is probably the original sign of scholasticide, at least that's what I found in my research, which is the theft and looting of 70,000 books from libraries and personal collections of Palestinians during the Nakba 48. So here we see the entry point for the scholasticide, because the militias, the Zionist militias who overlooked and often were driving this kind of looting, the same militias, for example the Haganah militia, the Zionist Haganah militia of the 20s and 30s and 40s, this is pre-state Israel, when it was more like paramilitary groups. So these same groups were the ones that joined forces and became the Israeli Defense Forces. So my point here is that, to me, I see a direct line all the way back to the Nakba 48, that this idea of trying to eradicate the notion of Palestinian identity, not only in the present, but also by attacking sources of collective memory. It's completely embedded to the DNA of the Israeli military. At least that's what I found while researching this. And most of the sources describing this are actually Israeli scholars from Tel Aviv University and other universities inside Israel, because they have access to the IDF archives. So they have a lot better, empirical data to investigate on this. Anyways, I would really recommend to Rafa Garden that you do a screening on this movie if you have the option. It's available for free on YouTube. And again, it's actually an Israeli filmmaker who tried to investigate this story of the theft of this book called The Great Book Robbery, from a movie from 2012. So I'll try to sum up. This is a quote from a recent interview with Ilan Pappé, the famous Israeli historian and writer of the book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And he's talking about Zionism here. And he says, they acted according to a logic of elimination of the native. And my point is that Scholasticide is exactly, a full-on manifestation of this logic. Because it's an attempt not only to kill the people of flesh and blood who are living in this very moment, but it's a way to try to eliminate the idea of a past, a present, and a future of Palestinian national identity, and also to kind of, eradicate the foundations for a future nation-state building. Whether it will be a one-state solution or a two-state solution, this is still a way of trying to obstruct the state building of Palestine. And I really hope that more people in academia will take the gloves off, as you say. I don't know if you can say that in English, but now I said it, and start talking about this, right? From a social scientific or political scientific point of view. It doesn't have to be dangerous speaking about this, even if you're inside academia. You can talk about it in a democratic dialogue and treating it like any other subject you would do research on. Okay, thank you very much for having me.